That's fucking acid he has. All the throwing balls and everything. Holy fuck. Jesus Christ, he's chip. Holy fuck, that. Joe's fucking fighting 3 fucking McDonaghs here at one time with a shovel and everything. We've got if someone's getting sparked out by a shovel or something here. Acid and everything.
Oh, it's piss and blood.
Is it?
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the sins of the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. He is the bare-knuckle boxer from a long line of champions, but it'll be a lifetime before he gets back to fighting. Joe Joyce Jr. said he was only defending himself in his home when he took a slash hook to a young neighbour who would later die from his injuries. Despite his claims of self-defence, a jury convicted him of the murder of 18-year-old John Paul McDonagh, and now Joyce is beginning a life sentence behind bars. So who is Joe Joyce Jr. and what is bare-knuckle boxing? Today I'm talking with Sunday World journalist Eamon Dillon, an author of Gypsy Empire, about the traditional way disputes between rival clans are settled, about how social media is used to goad underground contests, and how one of its most infamous characters has fallen foul of a violence that often spills out of the competition ring and into personal lives. Eamon tells me about what happened on the night John Paul McDonagh died, and he considers if the Joyce conviction will have any effect on the brutal contests. This is Crime World, a podcast from SundayWorld.com. I'm actually going to just tell you I don't know much about bare-knuckle boxing. Would that surprise you?
Not at all, Nicola. It certainly wouldn't. I mean, it's
Why?
a bit of a niche area, in fairness. I think even, outside the immediate enthusiasts, I don't think it's kind of a widely, I suppose, indulged in pastime. I mean, it would be a spin-off even of professional boxing or amateur boxing. So I mean, it is very much a niche area. So you can be forgiven for not being on top of this one.
Yeah, and I have seen some of it only because I'd be floating in around the office while you're, going through the stuff on YouTube and that. And, that's been going on for years. So but just explain what it is. Is it a sport?
Well, I mean, I suppose it is in one sense. You can argue over whether golf or hang gliding is a sport as well. But I mean,
golf
really
is a sport, Eamon, seriously.
Well, some people suggest it's a walk in the countryside punctuated by disappointments. But leaving that aside,
And what about rugby?
Rugby's a proper sport, absolutely.
Yeah, you see, showing your colours now.
To get back to your original question, I think it was originally it would have been part of the wider community years back. When I say years back, we're talking like 17th, 18th century, in that, you had your gentlemen folk would duel each other with pistols at dawn to settle an argument or questions of honour and such like. And they'd have their loyal sidekicks with them to reload their muskets or whatever it was before they managed to not shoot each other and get back to the billiard hall to continue drinking. And I think then kind of the poor man's version of that was rolling up your sleeves and going at it in a fair fight witnessed by your neighbours so that you could say, well, Eamon won that fair and square. He's an honourable man. And that would have been kind of often done on fair days. So people would have claimed that they were ripped off or, with the sale of a horse or a cow or something. So next time the cattle dealer or the person you bought off or whatever it was the argument is about, you'd settle it in front of all your neighbours, friends and business people so that it would be done and dusted, and you'd spit in your hands and shake, and that would be the end of it. That was the end of the argument until a new dispute arose. So I mean that would have continued on up, I imagine, in some country areas for quite a long time, and like a lot of traditions, some of them have lasted longer within the Irish travelling community for a variety of reasons. Partly because of I suppose there would have been the social isolation and again their love of tradition. And so, I mean, for many years it would have been, a clear-cut dispute resolution mechanism, a way to sort out an argument and that be the end of it. Don't argue with me, I beat you in a fair fight. But it has developed since then, and it's not quite what it was. And there's various factors for that, and part of it is I think social media has a big role to play now, and the fact that there never seems to be a resolution. Like there's always seems to be an excuse as to why there needs to be a rematch, and then somebody is refusing to take part in that rematch, and that then itself becomes the reason for another dispute resolution mechanism to be enacted. So it kind of goes on and on. But a lot of it is about trying to be...
It just sounds exactly like boxing to me there, the way you've described that. And do people retire and stuff out of it?
Well, they say they're not going to fight again, and some of them don't, and some of them come back. I mean, we'll get into it, like, certainly in more detail, but, like, I mean, there's fellas in their late 50s have come out of retirement to fight each other, you know, a death match two, like two big heavyweights that might have fought in the early 90s, you know, back in 2006, dusted off their singlets and got back into the laneway in a bog somewhere and went at it hammer and tongs until one of them bit the other in the ear, allegedly bit one of the other in the ear. And that was the end of that. And there hasn't been a rematch in that particular one since. But yeah, I mean, it goes on. And you get, like, you know, I'm sure when you were going through all your research with Clash of the Clans, you would have seen, like, some of these trash talking videos, and, you know, you've all seen the likes of Conor McGregor shaping up to an opponent at a press conference, chest out, nose to nose. And you can see the promoters just loving it, knowing that this stuff is going to go viral. And it's hard to know how much of it is staged and how much is real venom between the fighters. You know, are they really secretly going around the back having a cup of tea and a giggle about how they wound everybody up 5 minutes ago? But I think with some of the bare-knuckle boxers, you know, there's YouTube videos. Now, some of them aren't necessarily directly posted to YouTube. They're sent out on WhatsApp or on Facebook Messenger, and then they end up on YouTube. And a lot of them carry, you know, real venom to the point where they're making threats to kill in some cases, and you know, really, really poor insults of each other's mothers and sisters. I mean, people might be familiar with one, you know, suggesting that somebody's mother, that they were so poor that they use a bucket as a toilet, and therefore she had rings on her arse. And that was, I think, a meme at one stage that was taken up by people, I think, making fun of these guys. I mean, like, there's a certain almost Muhammad Ali-esque poetry to the way they kind of come up with insults. But at the same time, some of it's pretty vicious. And you can see it. You can see it kind of how it could escalate issues, so that instead of resolving a dispute, sometimes these bare-knuckle fights take on a momentum of their own and create 4 or 5 other reasons for wider members of any particular clan to start targeting each other for whatever, whether it's violence or more videos in which they're calling each other's names.
Now, before we get into Joe Joyce, and who's one of the stars of this world, let's just have a little listen to some of those call-outs.
Hello, Simon, this is me again. Your worst nightmare. I'm your worst nightmare. As far as I'm concerned, Anthony, we call you shite in the bucket. You're shite in the bucket for a whole 2 weeks. Again, my outfit was finished with you up in Dublin. You wouldn't leave the trailer, you were shite in the bucket for 2 weeks. But Simon, I'm christening you now, officially, shite in the bucket as well. Because again, I'm finished with you, I'm closing them for you, I'm closing your 2 eyes, and you're going to be shite in the bucket for 2 weeks as well. Simon, I was drinking with you in Navan. Navan, we give you the height of respect, boy. But nobody to know it now. Know your soft, dribbly mouth. Know your dribbly mouth, Simon. I busted for you. I busted for you. You're not none of your fucking Judas. Come out now, Simon. You've the name. You've the name. I've no name. You've the name. Come out now and fucking fight. Shite in the bucket. That's it.
We need to get on to Joe Joyce, who is one of the stars of this world. And he's been in the news this week, Eamon, Joe Joyce.
Yeah, Joe Joyce, he's originally from Moat in County Westmeath, a 32-year-old father of 4. And he comes from, I suppose he's at least a second-generation bare-knuckle boxer. And yeah, so on Monday, like, he'd been involved in a street row outside his home in Fermanagh, and I think it was in April 2020. There was I think 3 guys from a neighbouring house who were related, I'm told, to people that he would have fought as a bare-knuckle boxer, you know, sometime previously. And there was words exchanged. Their gardens actually backed onto each other, and there was words exchanged over the back garden fence, which resulted in 3 of the McDonaghs coming around to the front of the house. Now, Joe Joyce says he was interviewed by police, fairly shortly afterwards. And these statements were heard in court over, the last couple of months. And as far as he was concerned, he was in fear of his life. He was going to be attacked. One of them had something under his jacket. Now it turned out to be a bottle. He was worried that it was acid going to be thrown at him. One of them had a spade. There was other weapons being carried. And he took a slasher from his garden shed and went out to confront the three of them, to protect his wife Ellen and their kids. And this slasher, it's a slash hook. It's a long handled kind of curved blade. It's used, for clearing ditches, for that kind of heavy sort of agricultural work or, landscaping work. And he caught John Paul McDonagh on the lower leg. But I mean, the wound was deep enough and he basically bled out. He didn't die there and then. This happened on a Saturday night. He underwent emergency surgery, but he died the following Monday, an 18-year-old John Paul McDonagh. So that's what he was sentenced for. Now his defence was that it was self-defence. The video of the confrontation was partially caught on video, which kind of went viral at the time, and you can kind of the prosecution made the argument that he had plenty of time to back down and walk away, but that he continued moving forward, confronting, as far as he was concerned, the men who had come to attack him. And so the jury did find him guilty of murder as opposed to any other lesser, form of unlawful homicide. And I think it came as a shock, certainly to the Joyce family, and I think to a lot of people in the South who, in that situation, I think, the benefit of the doubt would be given that it wasn't a deliberate attempt to kill him. But again, there was evidence in court given, which I should add was disputed by Joyce's barrister, that his wife Ellen had been shouting at another woman who'd come out to tend to the dying John Paul McDonagh and had started shouting at her husband, finish him off. Now this was doubted. This was, hotly contested in court. So we can't necessarily know the truth of that, but it was in evidence. So, I think it kind of gives you the idea of kind of how furious the fight was. I suppose the fact that for years, Joe Joyce had been building himself up at this, as this guy who wouldn't be beaten in a fight. He'd be regularly, in his messages, I'll knock you out at one slap. I'm the boss. I'm not going to be beaten. So it'd be very hard for him to back away from a fight, having built up his own legend, I guess, for so long. So, I mean, it was kind of inevitable something like this was going to happen to him at some point.
Was his father the infamous Joe Joyce Jr., the guy that was always on the videos and was on documentaries?
Yeah. That's it. Yeah, it's the chap with the big gaucho moustache. I think people might have seen him. Yeah, I mean, well, it's Big Joe Jr. and Big Joe Sr. And Joe lives in a little bungalow just outside of Moat. And there was a time when I would visit on occasion, and he was always terribly friendly to myself and our old photographer Liam, who shared a love of horses with him, which helped us, I think, to have a chat. And there were, but he very much, this is, I think, in a way, it was kind of pre-social media days or before people had got the hang of it. And I think there was a lot of attempts at trying to deliver threats and messages through the pages of the Sunday World.
Oh, really?
About who they're gonna fight. So we'd have to kind of listen to a lot of this bluster before we could, kind of finally get to what we wanted to ask about, when was such a fight going to take place. And we wouldn't be speculating necessarily on who was going to win. But Big Joe Joyce, he really is international class when it comes to talking. I mean, he regularly features on his Facebook, singing away, having a beer. I mean, he was a great man for delivering verdicts on fights in fairly colourful language as well. And he's also had his fair share of violence. He's had clumps of flesh taken out of his arm and face. They've had a shotgun attack on his old house. On the current house they're in, it's been petrol bombs, windows smashed. They've had, they've had this kind of constant flux of violence. And you have to think that some of that is down to putting themselves out there so much. I mean, as a young guy himself, Big Joe Sr., he had a reputation as a bare-knuckle fighter, in the late 60s, when at the age of 18, he was taking on men much older. And, he had a famous clash against a guy called Dan Rooney from Crossmaglen. Now, Dan Rooney would have been seen as one of the top fighters at that stage. And there's a crazy VHS video of him fighting this other man called Ainie McGinley. Now, these are all names that are going to continuously come up in any discussion of bare knuckle boxers, because we're talking about the next generation, from these families. And Big Joe would have taken on Dan Rooney sometime after his famous fight with Ainie McGinley, and was going well, but was hit by Rooney in such a way that he went over on his leg and broke his leg, and insisted on being tied to a truck, standing up so he could finish off the fight. But I think on that occasion, the fair play men decided, they'd call it a day, and, gave the fight to Dan Rooney, which I think Joe was kind of, in one way he was half proud. He didn't, in one sense, like, the fight was awarded against him, but he didn't actually lose. He was the much younger guy fighting the established champion. But it gives you a sense of kind of the madness that I think surrounds some of these competitions.
I think you're answering the question when I asked you at the beginning about sport, and you threw golf in as well, suggesting that it wasn't a sport, but this doesn't seem to be, or certainly some sort of a mix in between. So you have these kind of obviously stars of the bare knuckle scene as such, but the violence seems to spill over from the actual contests into their real life and around their personal life. Did Big Joe Joyce, he was the fella who said that he used to dip his hands in petrol to make them hard for a fight, as opposed to, all those hand creams that are out there for ladies who want to make their hands soft. He did exactly the opposite, but he said that in a documentary, that was his little trick, was it?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things he said. I think he might have been trying to wind up some people that might set themselves alight then when they went to light their cigarette. It's hard to know if that was true or not, to be honest. But look, I mean, yeah, it's quite the character. I have to admit. In terms of physicality, like a lot of these guys that are who are seen as the serious fighters, like Big Joe, and as the name suggests, like both Big Joe Sr. and Big Joe Jr. are big men. Like, they're physically big men. When you're standing next to them, like, my rugby background, I'm kind of thinking like, here's a potential international number 8 or even a second row. I mean, they're all well over 6 foot. They're approaching 18, 20 stone. I mean, they are not small men. I mean, the likes of Paddy Jaws Ward and Barney the Gorilla McGinley are big men, and I think, I suppose there might even be a bit of pressure on them to fight because of that. I mean, there's quite like in boxing, obviously, it's in ring boxing or whatever, in licensed boxing, it's done by weight classification. So I mean, you have your flyweights and bantamweights, at the light end of it, and then you go right up to super heavyweights, which is where most of these guys would probably, I mean, they'd actually be too heavy for the heavyweight category. Like, you're talking, you're talking Tyson Fury sort of level of size, although his physique is probably yet that little bit bigger than some of these bare knuckle guys.
And do they get paid?
It's a good question, to be honest, because, sometimes, like, you see a lot of these videos before and after. Because, I mean, when you ask them, you just don't get a straight answer, to be honest. I mean, they'll tell you, yeah, there was 10,000 on that fight, there was 150,000 on this fight. But I think the explanation that seems to be the most accurate is that often, like, a fighter, if someone said, right, if you want to fight me, then you got to put up 50,000 euro. And if you do, I'll put up 50,000. And it's a way of getting people to shut up and not to be constantly saying, I'm going to fight you. We'll say, well, where's your money? You haven't been able to raise the money. And that they argue then that, or they'll say that the money comes from various members of the family, that so-and-so will put in 5 grand here and 10 grand there or whatever. And they'll gather together the 50,000. So this money then will be held by the fair play men. So the 100,000 then would, theoretically go to the winner, but it wouldn't be his money in that sense, all his to keep. He'd have to give back the stake plus the winnings to the members of the family who had put up the money in the first place, essentially backing him. So it'd be, a kind of a bet rather than a straight out prize. But you'd often find, I mean, there's so many of these, big money fights that are usually end in a draw with 2 very relieved looking fair play men, kind of delighted that after 40 minutes they got the 2 boys to finally shake hands and call it a day. Which is kind of, in one sense, the best result, because then there isn't going to be any disappointed people over losing their 15 grand or their 10 grand that made up the 120 grand stake that the two men were fighting over, or which, I mean, they call it, they're kicking money. And again, it's just a way of putting a price on, to see if somebody's serious. I'm sure there's a version of it goes on in professional boxing where, you pay a negotiation fee or whatever to make sure that you're really serious about you're going to follow through on this, and it's not just trying to get cheap headlines or cheap publicity that you're going to take on, some big champion. You really have to show that you mean business.
So, all this goes back, as you say, to the 17th century when people, worked out their disputes in fist fights in the middle of horse fairs, etc. As regulations come in and up to modern times, is this actually fully illegal to fight like that, or is it only if a complaint is made from either party? And how do they and where do they arrange these fights? Just
in terms of legality, I mean, any unwanted contact is common assault. But whether it's unwanted or not is getting a punch in the face when you've agreed to fight somebody. Is there consent to violence, as there is in sport? So it's probably not illegal in that sense. I think if somebody ends up keeling over and hitting their head on the concrete ground or a rock or whatever, then you're probably into manslaughter territory. So, and then again, if you have a big crowd of people who are shouting and roaring or standing around, you can argue then that it's at the very least, it's behaviour threatening to lead to a breach of the peace. But I don't know if it is. I don't know if it's straightforward illegal, to be honest with you. I know that when the guards do come across them, they'll break it up. But the guys just move on within minutes to another location. They'll always have somewhere where they're ready to go. I mean, myself and a colleague one time, we were invited to one of, I think it was actually one of Big Joe Jr.'s fights, and we got a phone call from someone else, not him, I might add, saying that the fight was on in such and such a place and to park up in Castle Pollard somewhere in Westmeath. And anyway, we took off in a pretty crazy convoy in the distance, so they were driving a bit faster than I think we were kind of prepared to at that stage. But anyway, we found all the cars parked up and walked up on foot up a lane into a boggy field, and things are about to get going when a sergeant and his trusty colleague trudged up and told everyone to go home or he'd be putting their names in a book. So at which point they all took off again at even greater speed, and basically we lost them. And the fight anyway went ahead in a farmyard in Kells, which it was a fair bit of a trip away over back roads, and it went on for about an hour, and it was a pretty tough fight, and there was about 60 or 70 people. So that was an incident of a fight that the guards were there and broke it up, stopped it happening, and it just it took place literally 45 minutes later in just a different county. So that's how quick it was. If everybody's agreeable and nobody's going to make a statement in connection with it, I suppose, what can they do? So you mentioned that it was Joe Joyce Jr.'s fight that you were invited to, and yeah, it was your slow driving, Eamon, that was the stumbling block to actually seeing this in action. But that was Joe Joyce Jr. So he's only 32, yeah. Yeah. So how long has he been? How long has he been at this? I'd say since he's 17, 18. He's a big kid. He was eager to get going. So I mean, and in fairness, he is a decent boxer. While he was living in Fermanagh, he actually won the amateur title, the heavyweight title in Ulster, and was at one point he would have been eligible for selection to compete in the Commonwealth Games. I think they were going to be on in Australia. Now they don't have to pick a team. He wasn't picked, as it turned out, but he was eligible to represent Northern Ireland at the Commonwealth Games. Now, I think he did, he won whatever round, and then I think he got a walkover in the final. I think the other finalist or whatever happened anyway, somebody didn't fancy their chances, and basically the fight never went ahead. So, but at the same time, he was the Ulster heavyweight amateur boxing champion. So I mean, and all of these guys now, all of them have serious backgrounds when it comes to boxing coaching. His brother Davey would have represented Ireland 15 or 16 times at youth level as a boxer. So he would have had Big Joe Sr.'s grandson Joe Ward is a professional light heavyweight now that at one stage is an Olympic prospect, and a serious fighter. Now, there's no suggestion he's involved in anything ropey like this. And he was a real promise. Like he swept aside. Do you remember Kenny Egan, the Olympic medalist? And he swept him aside in a contest, like I think in one of the national finals when he was just 17 or 18. So you had this kind of young fighter, clearing all the way before him. So I mean, like in that sense, like Big Joe Jr. comes from quite the, I suppose, a boxing dynasty. They're a family steeped in boxing, both in the bare-knuckle tradition and also in the licensed amateur and professional fighting game as well.
And as you've said, this bare-knuckle tradition regularly spills over into more personal insults and, people arriving at doors and people having to go out and, say, defend themselves. Was there shock that Joe Joyce Jr. was convicted of murder and is going to be sentenced? There is only one sentence for that, which is life. And do you think that lessons may be learned from what happened here? And those involved in it may have to try and, limit it to the more organised, farmyard scraps or whatever, but try and not have incidents like this happening around their home again?
To be honest, no, I don't think so. I don't think any lessons will be learned. I mean, like, these attacks, happen with a certain level of frequency. I mean, they don't normally result in someone dying, but every so often they do. And it's just, it's just that kind of, it's just that sense of being outside the law and that there's only one way to kind of resolve an argument, and there's not going to be any kind of, I'm going to let them break my windows and then report them to the police or to the guards afterwards. You have to kind of go out and protect your reputation and your manhood or whatever. And so that kind of thing is always going to, it's has the potential for always ending badly, I mean, it's kind of, they get caught up in their own kind of showmanship, I think, as well. And I mean, like, and there's loads of others. I mean, like I mentioned Dan Rooney earlier, like, and he was a showman at the time. There was like after his this crazy fight, in the middle of a baying crowd in front of a British Army Sanger in Crossmaglen in 1990. Like the next day, he was doing a kind of like a sports style interview. I think it was his cousin who filmed this interview. It's on VHS. It's a bit of a collector's item apparently. But he was there in his aviator sunglasses and his colourful kind of tracksuit top, and he's kind of more or less saying, well, he's accusing his opponent of basically having run away, like, and that, it would have been better for him if your man had stayed a bit longer so he could have beaten him properly. And, but having said that, his opposite number, Amy McGinley, had been picked up and borne away by his supporters on their shoulders with his arms raised in victory. So, so going back that far, here was a fight that wasn't, that still wasn't resolved, but there was that kind of showmanship, And I mean, it's funny because there was another fight that Rooney went to in the UK. I think it was in Hemel Hempstead sometime afterwards. He was fighting one of the Cashas. And again, on this kind of ancient video, they're all travelling over from Ireland to England. Now, Rooney himself lived in England, but there was a lot of the supporters, had arrived over, and they were all fairly well on in the pub, chatting away and being interviewed as if they were on their way to Wembley or Twickenham or some, Six Nations type sporting event. And so there was a great sense of celebration, and he kind of walked into this area then where his rival was waiting for him. And there was a young man seen shouting abuse, kind of saying, I'll take you on. And it was none other than the now famous Paddy Doherty as a young man. This is Paddy who won Celebrity Big Brother, who kind of, like, I think he started, a TV career in the UK, which was, I think, very interesting. He actually first, like, he was famous for My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding. He was kind of almost like an antidote to the over-the-top dresses that were going on, and he seemed kind of sensible and low-key, but he had, a great turn of phrase and a very likeable and honest sort of character, and people liked him. But his first appearance on British TV had actually been with Danny Dyer and UK's Hardest Men, and he was talking about his bare-knuckle fights, and he claimed he claims that it was unfairly edited, and that there was a part where he talked about that in a fight he'd bite off a bit of a man's ear and he'd swallow it so it couldn't be surgically reattached. But I think he says what he was actually trying to say is that that's the way he would have thought when he was a young man, and it wasn't something that he had actually done or would think of doing anytime soon. But then he ended up in Big Fat Gypsy Wedding. And then he ended up on When Sally Met Paddy, which is, the John Bercow, the Speaker of the House of Commons, his wife Sally, and they kind of did a bit of, kind of like house swap, where you come into my life and here we go. And she went into his life, and again, it was a big hit with the viewers. And he won a season of Celebrity Big Brother. He got down to the last time. It was between him and Kerry Katona, and the great British public voted in favour of him. But he was still involved. He's still been involved in acting as a fair play man, which is, I probably didn't explain this at the start. The fair play man, each fighter has one that they bring with them. It's like the old dueling seconds. They're there to observe all the rules are obeyed. They're pretty much the referee, and they're there to call the fight if, for whichever person, is deemed the winner. So, he's been involved in as a fair play man in fights, around this time. But he was also his reputation then, they're hard to get away from. He's been sudden, he's been kind of subject to kind of sudden attacks by, rival clans who kind of young men have wanted to prove their mettle against the famous Paddy Doherty. And again, he suffered some bad injuries, and he actually has a very good biography, which I read years ago now. And it's actually very good. It's a great insight, into kind of, the chaos that he had in his life, and the violence that was there, and it kind of gives you an idea as to where he's coming from. And he actually kind of had a reputation of a guy who stopped kind of rough families disrupting residential areas where he and other members of his extended family lived, and so much so that he was actually paid by some local authorities to maintain the areas where they lived. So he comes across well, I think, on TV, and that kind of showmanship. Even the likes of Dan Rooney, who retired years and years ago from fighting, he became a born again Christian, and he's probably better known among a lot of young travellers as a pastor rather than as a fighter. And he does these fire and brimstone speeches. It's all about a choice between Satan and God, good and evil, and you can see the showmanship there. That's still there, and it's the same thing, I guess, isn't it? In the kind of the license fighting, that whole kind of self promotion.
100%, but it seems to me like this ancient tradition from originally back to the 17th century has kind of collided with modern forms of social media and other things, that it's working in many ways for the celebrities within it. It's giving them a platform outside their own communities. But unfortunately for Joe Joyce, it was the CCTV that got him. For a man that was so used to, filming selfies and doing his call outs on YouTube, it wasn't actually, he didn't actually mean to be filmed that night that he went to war with the McDonagh brothers, and obviously that evidence that was then collected later by the PSNI is his undoing. Just finally, his wife Ellen in the courtroom was calling out, and she was devastated that he was being convicted, and she kept insisting that look, this was self-defense, etc. She previously was assaulted by him herself.
Yeah, that was part of the reason why they were living in Fermanagh, that the last time he hit her was in a Garda station in Tullamore, and the sentence was suspended for a period of 10 years on condition that he'd stay living outside of the jurisdiction, because at that time he'd said they were now living outside, so the judge says, right, stay outside, don't come back, you can come back 3 weeks a year, and for family bereavements, and that's the only time he was, supposedly allowed back. He was told to stay off social media, which he pretty much had done. Though it certainly wasn't as obvious if he was posting anything. It wasn't necessarily obvious it was coming from him. But yeah, no, he punched Ellen in a Garda station, and so again that was caught on CCTV. It was shown in court. Well, the judge saw it in court, and he described it as a disgusting and savage assault, and described him as a bully and all the rest. But there was a previous occasion in 2010 when young Joe was in court, and it sounded a lot more violent, and he actually got 18 months in prison. and there was a guard gave evidence that he used a horsewhip on her. He hit her with a horsewhip. He stuck keys in her head, and he hit her with a phone charger. And she had at one point had fled to a shelter, and the woman there, basically, Joe Jr. arrived at that location and basically demanded that his wife come out to him, and she decided she'd leave rather than her husband break up the house. And the woman who was there trying to provide a safe haven for Ellen ended up being threatened, and her own son, who was a guard, and he made threats to them, so he was separately imprisoned for those threats to kill as well. So I mean, that was actually appealed, and Ellen had tried to rescind her statement that she had made to the guards initially. But the judge in the appeal court wasn't having any of it, and the sentence remained as it was that time. But yet even then, she's stuck by him all through these years.
Is Joe Joyce the only bare-knuckle boxer, or certainly well-known one, that has a conviction of this kind?
Unfortunately, not. One of the best-known bare-knuckle boxers during all this era of Big Joe and Dan Rooney and Paddy Doherty is a man called James Quinn McDonagh, and he featured in Ian Palmer's documentary called Knuckle, which I think is on Netflix now and is worth a watch. But his younger brother, Mikey Quinn McDonagh, he wasn't as big as James, but he was mad to kind of prove his mettle. And he fought one of the Oxford Joyces one time, a guy called Paul Joyce, and he lost to him. But he seemed, and you can see this in the documentary. He was really anxious to somehow avenge this defeat. But like, Paul Joyce, of all of the bare-knuckle boxers, is probably the biggest. And again, he's another guy I've met, and when you're standing in his shadow, you know where he is. But it actually features in the documentary where they fought in somewhere in the UK, and there was a police helicopter overhead, and there's a huge crowd watching, and it was the sun was splitting the rocks that day, and you can see the two men are sweating profusely, and Quinn McDonagh is much smaller, but the bigger man, he can't deliver a knockout blow. He can't put Quinn McDonagh down. At the same time, Quinn McDonagh doesn't have the muscle. He's not big enough to finally land a knockout punch against him, and it's eventually ends in a draw. But you can see kind of the craziness there. I think that was around kind of the mid-2000s that fight happened. But then in 2012, to bring it back, sorry, to your original question, is there anyone else serving time for a similar offence? In 2012, basically he went off the rails at his house in Dundalk, and he used one half of garden shears and stabbed his wife Jacqueline to death. And it was a pretty frenzied attack. It was blamed on his use of cocaine and steroids. So he's been in prison now for the last 10 years. So it gives you, I suppose, it gives an insight into into kind of. Again, I think I've already used this phrase once or twice. Some of the madness and craziness that comes with this bare knuckle boxing world.
Well, look, Eamon Dillon, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola.
You've been listening to Crime World, a podcast from SundayWorld.com, produced by Ian Mullaney and edited by me, Nicola Tallant. If you like the podcast and love true crime, why not download the SundayWorld.com app for lots more stories from Ireland and across the globe?